Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I do love speaking about science, and being here representing the Prime Minister is an added bonus, because I think you're all starting to get the message that Malcolm Turnbull is certainly very committed to innovation and science, and he's made it very clear that he wants to make sure that we're developing the 21st century economy with science and innovation at the front and centre of that. So I'm delighted to be here representing Malcolm Turnbull. I have got a prepared speech which I should probably stick to a bit more closely if I'm representing the Prime Minister, but there's just a few things that I'd really like to say just to start. And it's so important given where we are at this point in time. We need to make a very strong statement about the fact that business needs science, science needs business, and Australia needs both. And what we have to be concentrating on into the future is making sure that we are putting together some really great connections between science and business so that we can build on what I believe is quite a strong base, quite a strong foundation, and that we can grow into the nation that we have the potential certainly to be. Now, I'd like to just start by touching on STEM in particular, and I know that that's been a bit of a theme already today, but just to, I guess, start by saying that when I first moved into the role as initially Parliamentary Secretary for Science, one of the first things I did was, when I knew I had responsibility for STEM and was pretty delighted about that anyway, I spoke to the Chief Economist at the Department of Industry and Science, and I said, well, assuming that we are going to be extraordinarily successful and we are going to get all these students to start studying science and maths at school, what are the jobs going to be for these kids? Because the last thing that we should be doing is embarking on a strategy to train all these people in science and maths, and there is nothing for them at the end of it. Now, he gave me a two-part answer to that question, and the first part of it was that we are a wealthy society here in Australia, and that we are well and truly prepared to pay people to support us. So we will pay for personal trainers, we will pay for people to, walk our dogs, wash our cars, we'll outsource a lot of the things that we don't want to do to other people. So there will be jobs for people who want to do that into the future. But then he started talking about the jobs of the future in terms of, I guess, in employment, and that raises in itself some issues. And he said, we don't actually know what the jobs of the future are going to be, and I think most of us here would agree we don't know what they are. Things are changing rapidly. But we do know that there are some core skills that will be required of those jobs into the future. And he spoke to me about a few. Coding is certainly one of them, so we need to ensure that our young people certainly have the opportunity to learn at least some basic skills in coding. With the amount of data that we are amassing, we are going to need people with very strong maths analytical skills so that they can analyse that data, and they will need to have very strong skills in statistics. And I think that all of that is very fair comment. But what we also need to do is look at the other component of STEAM, and I understand that there's debates about STEAM with arts as part of it, so, STEAM, but the other one is either eSTEM or STEAM with two E's, and that is the entrepreneurship that I think needs to be included in what we're doing into the future. And there's fortunately a lot of work that has already been done to look at ways that we can develop an entrepreneurial culture here in Australia, starting from the very youngest at schools and getting them to develop that right throughout their life. Now, I think that's wonderful and exciting. I will put a word of caution onto that, and that is that we have around about 23 million people in this country. Australia does not need 23 million entrepreneurs, okay? That's not something that we often go out there and say, and I think, quite frankly, we should. I think everyone needs to have certainly an understanding of what that involves. It might be their interest area, it may not, but as part of that, we also need teams behind the entrepreneurs who can provide the high level and in many cases technical skills that are needed for us to be growing and developing the businesses of the future. So I have spent some time myself in small business. I've started a number of small businesses. Some of those were successful. Some of them weren't. One was very successful. And I think that I've learned a lot out of that. And what I do know is that when I put my teams together, I needed to be able to draw on some strong technical skills in those areas, people that were prepared to work collaboratively to be parts of teams and to input into the entrepreneurship that I needed at that point in time. Now, if I can get back particularly onto STEM, what I would say is that we know that we have an issue with STEM skills into the future. And I would normally quote the figures, but it comes out of the Chief Scientist's report. And as he's sitting in the audience, I can assure you I don't want to get the statistics actually wrong. And whilst I'm confident, what I can say in very general terms is that if you actually compare the number of students in Year 12 over the last 20 years or so, we know that there are more students, but there are less studying physics, biology and chemistry. Yep. Yes. So, and I do encourage you to read the work of the Chief Scientist. I can tell you I'm a personal fan and you have done a fantastic job, and it's been a pleasure working with you, particularly in the STEM field, Professor Chubb. So we know that we have a significant issue with STEM skills. It's now time for us to get down to the practicalities of how we start addressing those skills here. Broad recognition there's a problem. How do we actually fix it? Now, there's a lot of work, fortunately, that has been done in that area, and a lot of it will come from the reports of the Chief Scientist in that space. I know CSIRO has done a lot of work, particularly in that area. It's now time for us to start pulling all of that work together so that we are certainly developing people with the skills that we know are needed into the future. Now, I think that's probably at this point enough said on STEM, and I'm very conscious of the time and that everyone will be keen for a coffee. So I'd like to just talk again quite briefly about industry researcher connections, because they are so important to us. And they're certainly the things that we need to be doing if we're going to develop our full potential. Now, having said that, I've just returned from Korea and from Singapore. And I've had the opportunity, in Korea I was at an OECD meeting, so I got to speak to quite a few of our close neighbours in the Asia-Pacific region, but others more broadly in Europe, about how they're actually going about engaging researchers and industry. What I'm looking for, and I certainly need your support, is to put together an action plan for how we do this. Now, I know that there's a lot of expertise here, and Larry, I've talked about you a lot in Singapore, and I did say I would be catching up with you on Wednesday, but I've caught up with you today. So I've got a lot more to say about Singapore and the connections over there. But I met with A*STAR, which is the equivalent of CSIRO in Singapore. And they are really doing some terrific work connecting with industry. They get significant amounts of money directly from the multinationals that are Singapore-based, but also some that are European-based as well, that are still injecting funds into Singapore for the research. So I had a long discussion with them about some of the things that they were doing that may be able to assist us in Australia. Now, certainly Asia is very strong at building relationships, and that's an opportunity for us here in Australia. I think there were some comments before about, Australia being quite isolated and our scientists perhaps not engaging as broadly as happens in some of the other countries. And what I would say to that is that we do have a particular way of working in Australia, which is unfortunately not necessarily engaging with our closest neighbours in the way that they expect us to engage. The Asians in particular, and I'm far from an expert in that field, but they certainly have focused very strongly on building relationships. And what A*STAR and other universities in Singapore in particular are finding is that the relationships are 15 years plus standing. So they have put in a significant amount of time to speak to the very senior people in the multinationals and to develop those relationships and demonstrate what they can offer to them. And I think that there are some real lessons in the way that Singapore in particular has gone about doing their work that we can use into the future, so that we're establishing the relationships and we are taking to the table some of the things that the Asian community in particular needs. Now, we know that the Asian market is very focused on health and ageing at the moment, and there are some real options and opportunities for us to go into that market with the work that we are already doing here in this country. Environmental sciences are very important amongst the Asian nations, but also the Europeans, and that was a very strong theme that came out of the OECD meeting, that we need to be looking broadly at environmental issues and the positive things that we can be doing for our environment. Part of that aligned really closely with what we have established with our industry growth centres already in Australia, but also the 9 research priorities are very closely aligned with what the rest of the world is doing, where they have very clearly identified what the future holds for them, and they are working hard to make sure that they are streamlining the areas that they are growing in and developing in, so that they are not trying to be, within their individual countries, a one fit for everything, so that there is a broad spectrum of things that they are concentrating on. They have formed the view that they're much better if they actually focus on what their key strengths and key priority areas are. So I guess to bring this all together, where is Australia at the moment? We are actually in a very, very good place. We have some leading research institutes here in Australia. We have already demonstrated that we are very good and strong researchers, not only with fundamental research, but also with applied research as well. So we have some opportunities to grow and develop into the future. We have to be looking at the industry connections and making sure that we are capitalising on those as well. Quite frankly, we put $9.7 billion into research in Australia, just from the federal government alone. There will always be arguments that there should be more money put into research. It will always be limited what any government can do in terms of just handing over the hard, cold cash. So the opportunities now are for our universities and research institutions to engage with our multinationals, to engage with our large organisations, but also our medium and our small enterprises, and form the links that are needed to support the research that we are already doing in Australia, so that we can support the businesses as they grow and develop, and we can build the Australia of the future that I think everyone in this room and throughout Australia would agree we should be focusing on.